Okay guys, welcome back to the channel, and today is an exciting day because I'm finally starting the series I've been wanting to do ever since I started this channel. The vocal rankings are still going to happen, there's going to be opinion based videos and top 10s and all that stuff still going on, but the main focus I always wanted was to be vocal analyses of singers. And right now we're going to look at K-pop main vocalists, K-pop soloists, and anyone else that kind of tickles our interest all the way through. And who better to start this new series with than my favourite vocalist, should you watch that video, Mr. Kyung-soo Dio, as most would know him. I'm so excited to get this done. I hope you guys like it, and I hope it can be the format that everyone will enjoy and appreciate. Without further ado, let's get into it. The analysis of Dio. Right guys, so before we actually get into the main bulk of the video, I want to explain kind of how I'm going to structure this to make sure you guys get the most out of it and find the parts that you actually want to watch and are interested in. So what I'm going to basically do is do an overview of who they are, what they generally sound like, kind of things that people who might not know about the vocalist would need to know straight away, just a general overview of what they sound like. Then I'm going to try and make these videos quite long and quite detailed, and there's going to be a fair amount of technical words and things like that used, but I don't want to kind of beat you around the head with anatomy or sciencey things, so it's mainly going to be kind of basic like chest voice, head voice, placement, all that sort of thing that I always talk about on the channel, but there's going to be a little bit more of that. It'll be slightly less generalised than it will normally be. So what I'm going to do is separate the video into a few different sections. Firstly, I'm going to go into low range, middle of the voice, high range, explain a few things there, technically what they do, with examples laden throughout. There's going to be a lot of clips intercut with my commentary, which normally I know I don't do, but I think for this particular video type, it's easy to put in, makes a lot more sense, and people will be able to understand what I mean by certain things if I show Kyung-soo actually performing that particular part of his voice. After that, I'm going to do a slightly more generalised breakdown and summary of what I meant, so there'll be a strength and weaknesses kind of section, which people will maybe want to skip over to if they don't want like the long-winded explanation. I know a lot of you people will be here for that individual breakdown of each part of his voice. Some of you won't, and I'll put a link into the description when it gets to the more generalised thing like that. As well as that, I'm going to do a changes over time, so anything technically that I've noticed between debut and kind of later comebacks and things like that from EXO and stuff like that. And then I'm just going to do kind of a general summary at the end, as well as anything else I've pointed out or noticed about his particular voice, be it strengths that most idols don't do, or any insight as to why certain things happen in performances or with his voice or technical stuff like that. So yeah, it's going to be a whole lot of technical jargon. I'm going to try and make it as simple as I can, but also as in-depth as I can to make it actually useful. And yeah, basically that's how the video is going to be structured. I'm going to start with a general overview, and I hope you guys appreciate the way we're going to do this. From now on, no more preamble, we're just going to be looking at Kyung-soo's voice all the way through. I hope you enjoy it. Right, let's actually get going. Okay, so to start everything off, obviously if you're an EXO fan or a Dio fan, you know all of this. But for anyone coming into this on the channel who isn't necessarily an EXO fan, who is Dio? Okay, so Dio is one of the three main vocalists in EXO. EXO are regarded as having one of the top, if not the top, vocal lines of main vocalists in K-pop. A lot of that is because of Chen and Baekhyun, but also our man Dio. So Dio's voice is a lot kind of heavier and thicker than most people would actually take credit for. Just listen to the way he speaks right now.
저한테 경수연이라고 하시는 분들 중에 혹시 저희보다 나이가 어리신 분은 없죠?
So his spoken voice, as you can tell, it's a little bit fuller, a little bit thicker, but it's not that dark. Now what I mean by a dark vocalist, or someone that would speak with a kind of darker timbre, will be somebody more like this.
안녕? 너나 말씀이 주기를 들어. 난 월세의 세종대왕 이더라고.
Okay, so Dio's voice, as you can see, is kind of, it's placed a little bit further down when he speaks like a huh. It's got a hooty quality to it, which means that he has an ability to actually have a depth to his voice. Dio's vocals are generally known for sitting in a higher range with a nice light flexibility but a nice heavy chesty mix. What I mean by a chesty mix is it sounds full, supported, big, and has power and projection up at an F4, G4 and occasionally higher. For example, okay, so not every single idol vocalist would do this. Some people would strain up to their mix, would use a more throaty configuration, some would be airy in this configuration, some would just have different ways of actually singing in this middle part of his voice. As I say, Kyung-soo's voice is very famous and very powerful. He has a soul-driven R&B style vocal delivery. And again, as I say, his voice has a depth to it, but also has a lightness to it, which means he has a nice flexibility in his low range, in his high range, and in the middle of his voice in that particular more R&B soul-driven way. So, what does this mean? Where does his voice particularly work? Is his lower range great? Is his middle of his voice great? Is the higher part of his voice great? And what does all of this technical stuff mean when you put it into each particular part of his voice? Where does he excel and where could he be better? Now, that is what we are going to look at right now, starting with his lower range. So, how exactly, as an overview, is Dio's lower range? A couple of things we first need to know about is firstly, K-pop as a general rule is written in an insanely high key. So a lot of these guys, outside their natural tendency to sing in their comfortable lower notes, don't really need to train much lower than that. As well as that, Dio, as well as many other K-pop idol main vocalists, is a tenor voice. Now, a lot of tenor voices in K-pop will have a lower range that probably bottoms out at somewhere near an E3, F3 sort of area, because most of the time they're going to be doing really high belts or really high mixed voices or head voices or things like that. Dio in EXO was often in charge of doing some of the harder, more difficult parts, not only in a higher mixed place, but also in the lower end of his voice. Because of Dio's naturally thicker coordination in his vocal delivery and his spoken voice, he has a really comfortable, easy, well-projected lower register. Now, he doesn't have a baritonal low note or anything like that. He doesn't go into a really low configuration very heavily or use much in the way of muscle and chest dominance to get a really beefy big sound down here. But as tenor vocalists go, Kyungsu's low range is actually very solid. It's got a decent capability, and while it's actually in the lower general part of his voice in the third octave, it has a very nice vocal quality, a very nice vocal characteristic, and actually stays very supported, I believe down to a D3 or so. So, how does it actually sound generally? So I'll play a few clips of the way that Kyungsu's voice normally sounds in the lower end of his voice, and you can get a gauge as to how it actually sounds. So, what makes this particular part of his voice really good? Dio, unlike a lot of male tenors in K-pop, sings his whole low range with a neutral larynx. Now, if you don't know what a neutral larynx is, a larynx is basically your vocal folds, and it's the way your voice kind of just sits. You can set it up a little bit or down a little bit to make it have different phonetic qualities. If you keep a neutral larynx all the way through, singing generally becomes much easier and much more balanced. Now, a lot of male idol vocalists will naturally drop their larynx to try and hit this lower note because their voice is naturally more capable in this higher, lighter, breathier region. As we mentioned earlier, Kyungsu's got a very naturally darker voice, not super dark or baritonal dark, but it has a depth to it. Because of that, in his low range, he isn't having to force his larynx down to hit notes around a D3, E3 or F3. Now, a lot of the time, tenor vocalists won't really need to sing down here. The sub-vocalists or the baritone parts will cover that section of the voice. However, Kyungsu is often given a lot of lower notes. In a lot of EXO songs, he starts them or just has parts where he uses his vocal agility, vocal run to sing down a kind of scale, and he isn't struggling one little tiny bit. That is mainly because he keeps his voice very supported in this area, because he keeps a nice neutral larynx, uses his naturally darker, deeper voice with the thickness of it, and manages to sing in this area nice and easily. That does not mean he doesn't have difficulties extending that lower part of his range, and there isn't some technical limitations that do happen as he goes a little bit lower, but at this D3 area, or a little bit higher than that, his voice sounds nice, it sounds supported, it sounds dark but not too dark to the point where he can't do anything with it as he goes higher, and it has a nice phonetic quality. It's quite light, he doesn't use a lot of beefy power or really project like that or anything like that. He keeps it nice and soft, nice and easy, but very comfortable. Kyungsu's lower range is extremely comfortable when he does it in the part of his voice that works extremely well. Here are a few more examples of him singing in the lower range and how comfortable and easy it is compared to some other idol tenors that I'll put in as well.
제대로 잘 먹어 다 지나가니까 어쩔 수 없었어 버렸어 모든 감정을 Think I'm crying on my own.
Okay, so as you've seen, where it works at the D3, E3, F3, Kyungsoo has a fantastic low range. As idle tenors go, really easy, really comfortable. That doesn't mean that he doesn't struggle to extend that low range, which he could easily do doing a few different things. His technique in his low range might be almost too perfect to the point where he doesn't allow things to happen to get a little bit lower. Now that might sound like a kind of strange thing to say, but below the D3, Kyungsoo has shown notes getting a little bit lower than that, at a C3, B flat 2 sort of area. However, his voice loses all stability, all support, and all kind of vocal characteristics as he goes a little bit lower. At the D3, he's still comfortable and easy in a chest voice, a light, easy chest voice with nice air, which is keeping it all solid all the way through and light. However, as he goes lower, he doesn't beef it up or load larynx at all, which makes the voice go from just to air. A lot of idle tenors will sing very airy with very little vocal phonation down low anyway. And Kyungsoo, as idle tenors go, has a good low range at the D3, but as he does extend it lower, he doesn't allow his vocals to change technically to get anywhere lower than that. A lot of people, myself included, to sing in a low range will load larynx naturally and just project. And while that isn't super comfortable to do a lot of the time, if you do it a little bit and use a bit more chest in the sound, Kyungsoo will probably have a little bit more ease as it goes a little bit lower. Again, as an idle tenor, you don't need to be in the second octave a huge amount. However, that is one thing to note. For example, watch him sing a little bit lower than the D3 here. As you can hear, the voice does somewhat just fall away and die immediately. Again, that's because he doesn't lower his larynx at all or use much chest in his low range. And when it goes below the supported, easy, comfortable notes that his delivery allows for, the voice does, as you see, fall away totally into air. Now that is something you can change using more of a chest dominant coordination. You can, as I say, load larynx a little bit, or you can do a few things here and there to mix your vocal fry up into that space. Now again, Dio's been going long enough to know he doesn't really need to operate in those particular areas, but as a low range goes, it's already very good, but it could easily be extended down with a few technical tweaks here and there. But generally, if your voice becomes quite airy below a C3 as an idle tenor, it's not a huge deal. Dio, however, has also showcased he has another way of going fairly low, which isn't quite as usable, but it is worth mentioning in a low range video for Dio himself, and that's using his vocal fry. Okay, so I couldn't find many examples of Kyungsoo actually doing this, but it is worth mentioning he has an ability to use his vocal fry to get quite deep into the second octave. Most sources have his lowest note as a C2.
아니야, 이거 안 돼.
As he goes a little bit higher in F2. Now a C2 for a tenor vocalist is awesome. Again, it's not in a coordination that's like really usable. He would never put it in a song. He would probably go no lower than an octave higher than that at the C or the D3. But it is worth mentioning that Kyungsoo has an ability to sing in his vocal fry to get to this low part of his voice. Now, for you guys who know what vocal fry is, you know, it sounds like it's a creaky coordination. But for those who don't, it's essentially putting your vocal folds kind of together, reducing how much air you put through them and making a very glottal kind of slowed down sound. So instead of being like a in like a chest voice, it's it's essentially that. Now Dio, when he did his lowest note, went and it's very, very fry. It's not super usable, but it is a way to extend the lower register. Some people, mainly bass singers, sing in this low range while mixing their chest voice with their vocal fry. Kyungsoo doesn't do anything like that. He doesn't have a usable register down here, but it is worth noting that an octave lower than where he actually sings generally in a softer, comfortable chest voice with more air to make it more comfortable and easy and supported, he can actually beef down a lot lower into that vocal fry space. I only found one clip of it, but here it is. Okay, so basically Dio's low range, as I've showcased, it's comfortable, it's easy. As idle tenors go, it's very extended and it's very strong and very, very comfortable. And he would sing in this area of his voice a lot more than most idle tenors. And it's probably the second most impressive part of his voice that he utilises fully, often, and knows exactly what he's doing with it. He doesn't really do much in the way technically to get lower than his comfortable supported notes that his vocal style allows for. However, he has showcased on occasion he can get a lot lower using a configuration that isn't really melodically used in EXO's songs, and he doesn't really need to go much lower because of the key that EXO are written in. So basically, yes, Dio's low range, very solid, very good as idle tenors go, and it's a very comfortable, easy part of his range. Is it the most impressive? Absolutely not, but is it comfortable and supported and well delivered? Yes. Okay, so before I go on to explain what I mean by the middle of his voice, it's important to quantify what I mean by the middle of his voice. So, just for the basis of this episode, and probably most, I want to separate it into 3rd octave, 4th octave, and 5th octave. And there's quite a few things that Kyungsoo does in the 4th octave as part of his vocal delivery, be it in the slightly lower, more comfortable parts, and his very famous belt. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to separate it the best way I can into those 3 kind of octaves to make sure we know what we mean by middle of the voice. Okay, so I'm going to split this little part into 2 kind of sections, not their own parts individually, just things to keep in mind. This first part, I'll very briefly explain his lower, more comfortable middle of his voice, so like the upper 3rd octave, lower 4th octave, what he does there to blend everything up and down into the rest of his voice. And then afterwards, I'll mention his very famous belt, what he does, any limitations technically, and things he does particularly well. So, without further ado, what does the middle of his voice sound like when he's not going into that super heavy belt mode? Well, let's listen to a few examples. So as you can hear, when Kyungsoo is in the middle of his voice, just above his low notes and below the belt that we'll get into, his voice has a really light, bright vocal timbre. The very good thing about this part of his voice is it blends together beautifully the depth of his natural spoken tone and the lightness that he can operate in with the tenor in the FAC system. The fact that he has a tenor voice means that he can sing in this C4, D4 area like it's nothing. For me personally, I'm a baritone, I've started to go, this kind of place already. I'm ready to bring up a lot of chest voice, try to mix down into that place. And as a tenor, that sort of area of your voice is generally fairly easy to navigate, and Kyungsoo's is no exception. The way he operates this particular part of his voice is very, very sensible. He uses it very bright and very light, but because of the natural heaviness in his tone, he can keep it chesty enough to the point where he can choose what he wants to do with it as he goes up or as he goes down. As he blends down into it, you notice in the low note section that his voice, when he's in his lows, while it's got a depth, it's also got a lightness to it, which can blend up into this space perfectly and beautifully with no strain, no overcompression, and sounds very good, very forward, and very easy. As well as that, in this lower kind of middle part of his voice, he operates in such a light, easy configuration, sort of like that he can blend up, and he can use the chest voice and the natural depth that's in his tone to go up into that belt that we'll mention very shortly, or he can go into more of a falsetto, airy place depending on what he wants to do with it. In this particular section of his voice, he has a lot of control, a lot of choice of shades of what he wants to go for with his timbre. He can go light and more airy, or he can go a bit more powerful, a bit more soul heavy. His voice here is very good, very easy, and very consistent. There's no overcompression in this area whatsoever, which is why his upper belt, as we'll get into very shortly, is very resonant, open, and full. But that would not be able to be achieved if the bit below had any overcompression or a lack of technical skill. So just to basically summarise that little part, this part of his voice is great. As you hear it, it's nice and light and nice and free and has a lot of space to go into, either up or down, and there's no technical limitation here whatsoever, not really. So, a lot of EXO fans will know Dio primarily for his belt range. The interesting thing about Dio's voice is, again, because it's heavier in tone than the other 2 guys in the vocal line, Chen and Baekhyun, when he sings, he's responsible for EXO's higher notes, but not their high notes due to lack of ability in the 5th octave, but we'll get into that in a later section. The way his voice operates is in a very chest-heavy, powerful, forward belt. His voice is very strong, very projected, very connected, and very supported all the way through. Now, before I get into where it works notes-wise, what he's doing really well or really poorly, let's have a look at some of the belt notes that he actually performs in the songs and kind of break down what he does pitch-wise and technically. Okay, so one thing we need to quantify before we mention Kyungsu's actual mixed voice is what exactly is a mixed voice. Now, a mixed voice is really difficult to kind of quantify. There's a lot of things that go into it. It can be vowel shapes, placements, all things like that. But essentially, it's bringing up a chesty weight into a head space phonator. Essentially, I've got a video on my channel that I made quite a while ago, which may be a little bit primitive, but it has a general fact on there, or if you want to look it up from other people who explain it a little better than I can. But mixed voice is essentially what you want to be doing in a belt range. There are people, me included, who pull chest voice up to the point where it struggles and it can't do anything higher. There's people who use a very head dominant mix, which is something I do also, to have a lighter, more kind of free ability in this upper part of their voice. Kyungsu does what a lot of people really want to do. It has a chest dominant heavy forward mix, like a but like obviously a lot of notes higher than that because I don't really operate as high as Kyungsu. Now, the benefits of having that mix is that all the way through his voice sounds very powerful. It's very open and his placement is very good all the way through his belt range until it stops working a little bit afterwards, but we'll get into that in 1 second. Where his voice really works very well is the F4 and G4. Now, a lot of tenors have an ability in this area anyway, but Kyungsu isn't pulling any chest weight from his throat. He's not allowing too much head to come down and make it a soft, airy sound. His voice is big, open, full, and projected. Listen here. The great thing about Kyungsu's voice as well is because he's so consistent in this style and in this coordination of using a chest dominant heavy mix without any kind of inherently problematic placement, is he can also bring his voice into a space that a lot of tenors really want to operate in, and that's the A4, and occasionally he can get a B flat 4 while supported. He's gone a little bit higher while bringing kind of more head voice in, but it's nowhere near as big, full or connected, but we'll get into that in a second. His voice up at this A4, and occasionally a B flat 4, still sounds big and full and powerful, and his voice could not sound that way if his technique in this particular part of his voice wasn't fantastic. Okay, the only issue this really brings forward is because he uses such a chest dominant placement, he doesn't allow naturally his head voice to blend down in to go for a really kind of more balanced heady mix, which is what Chen and Baekhyun do a lot of the time to get these really high kind of 5th octave notes. Kyungsu doesn't generally have that ability. He's playfully shown it on occasion, but generally he doesn't sing in the 5th octave anywhere near as much as the other two guys, because he doesn't blend much head voice down into his mix, allowing him to get a little bit higher than where his chest on the mix really works very well. So for example, a 5th octave head dominant placed mix. As you see, Kyungsu's is quite a lot different to that, but Kyungsu's, where it works in that particular 4th octave between the F, G, A and B flat 4, sounds fantastic, open, full, and there are no complaints in this part of his range whatsoever, except for the limitations that a lack of head voice can bring. It is worth mentioning, and I'll actually go through this in the change in time section properly, but that part in man, which is where he goes, and I got your mind. He was asked to do that note briefly, and obviously his voice doesn't really operate in that sort of area too well because he doesn't bring that chesty mix up any higher with the addition of a little bit of head voice to bring down into that mixed place, which is why occasionally in debut stages he did struggle a little bit, but I'll get into that. Another example is where his really chest dominant, strong, consistent mix wasn't an issue but a factor in changing things in a live setting was Call Me Baby. Now, towards the end of that song, he has a part where it's like, turn out to magic, yeah, or something like that. It's really big and it's like a C5, D5 mixed belt. And live, Kyungsu more often than not, tends to go for the B flat 4. That's basically his highest supported belt note that he consistently do, and that's because, again, his chest dominant placement allows for a really powerful full sound all the way through that particular part of his range that is excellent and consistent and fantastic, but because he doesn't bring that head voice down into it, he does struggle to get to that C and that D5 in a mixed place that Baekhyun and Chen maybe could operate in a little bit better, and he tends to go for the more supported lower B flat 4. Just have a look at it right here. It is just something to bear in mind that does come as part of using a chest on the mix rather than allowing a head voice to blend in for a more big powerful sound. But it's not exactly a big deal. Not everyone needs to sing in the 5th octave, and Baekhyun and Chen can handle that. Dio in the 4th octave, he sounds fantastic, resonant, full and powerful. Now, it wouldn't be an objective analysis if I didn't mention some limitations and weaknesses that Kyungsoo's mixed voice does have. The main general issue that Kyungsoo does have more often than not is his mind when he's not that relaxed. So generally, when he's singing, as I mentioned, his mixed voice is forward, it's placed very well, there's no throatiness and there's no kind of weakness of air or anything like that. It's a nice full projected sound. On occasion, when he's not feeling it, one of two things can kind of happen. Either the worst thing, obviously a voice crack can take place. Every single person, every idol has had a voice crack at some stage. It's very easy to have a full kind of and your voice just kind of give way. Voice cracks can happen because of fatigue or because of many other different factors. It's not always an issue, but generally when he's relaxed, he alleviates voice cracks with very good placement and technique. Another thing that Kyungsoo can kind of do on occasion is even in his F4, G4, A4 wheelhouse that he's very good at and very consistent, he can sometimes look up to belt these notes. Now that isn't inherently an issue. A lot of singers look up to get a kind of more space and more feeling, but more often than not if you're looking up it means your larynx is probably going to be naturally raising a little bit, which can make notes that would previously be like much more shrill, and it just wouldn't have the same phonetic quality. Yes, it can sometimes help people reach higher notes, but it is not healthy to belt with a high larynx more often than not. It's very fatiguing and very damaging, and occasionally Kyungsoo can get into a bit of a habit of actually raising his larynx to hit notes, and sometimes that can make them shrill and thinner. And occasionally it can make them more of a yell if he's got tense jaw. He can go and it can sometimes, yes, it gives you good space, but if your jaw is tense, it's not giving the freedom and the openness and the resonance to belt in the way that you normally would. For example, this G4 that he hits right here. It doesn't sound bad by any means, but it's more of a it's more of a yell than it is a melodic singing note. So it is worth mentioning that Kyungsoo, while firing, is fantastic and very consistent, has an amazing mixed voice, but if his mind isn't at ease, he can sometimes yell a little bit, pull into things, or use a high larynx while he's belting on occasion. It's not really a thing he does much anymore. It's not a huge issue, but it is something to bear in mind in a vocal analysis of this type. Okay, so that's basically it for Kyungsoo's middle of his voice. There are things I could mention as he goes a little bit higher, but we'll put that in the next part, which will be his higher range. Okay, so the last main section of Kyungsoo's voice I want to mention is his higher range. Now this section is going to be a little bit shorter than the lower range in the middle part of his voice, as he simply doesn't use it as often, hasn't actually implemented many notes in the 5th octave a great deal because Chen and Baekhyun mainly handle those parts of the vocals. However, Kyungsoo has on occasion showcased a little bit of falsetto work, a little bit of high mixed voice work, and generally he tends to focus mainly on his upper belting, but he has occasionally scooped into the 5th octave on occasion. Predominantly, he uses a disconnected falsetto, which I'll mention very shortly what that means and how you produce it, but this is kind of what it sounds like generally. Okay, so that there was Dio singing in a disconnected falsetto. Now, before I mention anything else, what is a falsetto and why is it disconnected? Okay, so most people generally know what falsetto is. It's the noise of kind of going, hoo. It's like an airy, breathy, higher note that most people will use to access kind of easy to achieve and nice and relaxed higher notes. Okay, so the way that Kyungsoo tends to do them is he reduces most of the weight, allows his vocal folds to open and allow mainly air just to kind of pass through them. Some people use the falsetto with a little bit more grab, like a like more of a general head voice or a reinforced falsetto. What Kyungsoo tends to do is keep it very easy, very relaxed, and he uses this general, very easy to achieve transitional register of his voice to get into higher notes. Now he tends to sing in this area around a C sharp or a D5. He can operate a little bit higher than that, but it gets a little bit shrill, but generally he's very comfortable and very relaxed up at this C sharp 5 area, as a lot of idol tenors would be as well. Let's watch him sing that.
Nothing better, nothing better.
Okay, so as I said, there are ways to hit that harder with a mixed voice or a reinforced falsetto, but a lot of people, myself included, have a really easy time singing with this disconnected falsetto up in this range. Now, it's not a problem if you use disconnected falsetto. It only really matters as a problem if you can't really transition it down into the rest of your range. However, Kyungsoo does not have this problem as he goes down to the middle of his voice, be it the softer, easier vocals with more air, or the more powerful mixed voice. He can always transition from this kind of area. He can do this transition, not a problem, with no problem whatsoever. Now, if you use a really disconnected falsetto, that doesn't allow you to get really much higher than kind of the areas that they're operating in here, at the C sharp or the D5. And Kyungsoo is kind of the same as that. He has to do a technical other change to get a little bit higher, which he hasn't done a great deal, but there has been an occasion where he scooped it to an F5. Now, watch it here. Okay, so what is he doing here? What he is doing in this instance is he's getting a little bit more weight and compression of vocal cords and using an oo vowel. Now, oos are really good to get into a higher place. It's very easy to do that. And he's allowing a little bit more grab and a little bit more weight with his falsetto in the head voice. But he's also bringing a little bit more chest voice, a little bit more power, and allowing it to round out in this classical soprano head voice kind of sound. Now, Dio hasn't showcased this on many occasions. He clearly isn't very familiar with this area of his voice, and he hasn't really showcased much higher than that outside of kind of isolated woos, which a lot of people can just do generally. That's not really showing too much melodic skill, but he has showcased a couple of times that he can get to around an F5 if he really concentrates with his particular coordination, but generally he hasn't explored this coordination a great deal when it comes to his falsetto and his head voice use. So mainly he uses a relaxed falsetto up to a C, C sharp 5, maybe a D5, and that's where he's generally comfortable, with a few notes above that as an extension. However, that is not the only way he operates in the 5th octave, but it's the predominant way that he does it when he does do it on occasion. He also uses a really high forward mix, but not very often. Let's watch that. Okay, so remember earlier when I said that Chen and Baekhyun tend to do the really high forward, big, heavy mixes in their head voice with a head dominant mix? Now, Dio has showcased this on occasion, but as I've mentioned before, the middle of his voice when he uses the chest dominant mix with the forward, big, projected, supported placement, that's what he generally does most of the time. But as I showed in that particular clip there are isolated instances here and there where he gets to around a D5 or an E5 with a slightly more powerful full configuration. Now what he's doing here is keeping hold of that weight from the chest voice, allowing it to go higher, thin out and lighten out, using a little bit more head to mix down into it to achieve more of a ha kind of area rather than the ha ha ha. It's a slightly different phonetic quality to it, and it's not as easy to maintain, absolutely not, unless you're very practiced in this higher 5th octave belting. Then you're not really going to have much sustainability with this particular vocal coordination, and Dio is absolutely the same. He's only showcased this on a number of occasions. Early his debut where he kind of sang in the 5th octave doing this sort of coordination, it's clearly something he's not that comfortable with. It hasn't really developed on a great deal because he's much more adept and much more used to using more chest voice in his sound to stay in the 4th octave with a really big powerful forward coordination. But as I say, he has showcased on occasion him mixing down into this E5 area, but he hasn't really showcased parts where he's sustaining a big belt or he's doing sections in this higher part of his voice. He's very much going to a quick note and then transitioning back down to a more comfortable place. So Kyungsoo's voice absolutely isn't built necessarily to sing up in this area, but he has showcased that when he's on his day and he's mixing down very well using head voice in that chest dominant place, he can achieve slightly higher mixed voice notes. But they're absolutely not optimum, they're not what he predominantly does, and it's nowhere near the best part of his range. It's really unexplored, and we haven't seen too much of him doing this. That doesn't mean he can't do it much, but in EXO's songs and EXO's discography, Chen and Baekhyun are mainly given those parts, and they do it live, and Dio stays a little bit lower in the 4th octave doing those high, amazing belts. So, overall, I know it wasn't as long a section, he doesn't use his upper range a great deal at all, and generally just to summarise, he uses a nice disconnected falsetto, nice and relaxed around the C sharp 5 or so like most alto tenors would be, transitions down beautifully around the A, the B, the F4, all of that to make it a nice seamless instrument all the way through. He's also showcased on occasion his ability to mix with more power and chest dominance in a head dominant space, but generally he doesn't use this part of his voice very much. It's very underexplored, and he clearly isn't as comfortable with it as he is with the rest of his range. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not everyone sings super high, and he's more of a powerful mid-belter tenor, and that is totally fine, and that is totally okay. But that is basically the high notes, the low notes, and the middle of his voice generally. But there is more to Dio's voice. Let's have a look at some agility, and then change it over time in one lovely section before we wrap up the strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so one of the biggest reasons that people love Kyungsoo's voice is his tone. He has a very R&B, sultry, soulful tone. Now, something that comes along with singing in a genre in that way is vocal agility. Most people accept and agree that Kyungsoo has one of the more agile idol voices in K-pop. This isn't really up for debate. There are a lot of idols that attempt to use vocal runs and vocal agility and melisma to move around different pitches and different styles of vocal delivery, but not many can do it with the level of ability and aptitude as Kyungsoo does. Some people try it and aren't too successful. Some people try it and are okay on occasion. Some people can't do it at all, but Kyungsoo is absolutely fantastic at this. So basically a vocal run is getting a pitch or a scale and going up and down the scale. It's something I can't do. I have absolutely no soul in my voice whatsoever. A lot of people try and do it and have misplaced accuracy with notes or go out of key or lose projection in certain parts of their voice. Kyungsoo doesn't. He knows exactly where it works with the vocal runs and agility that he implements, mainly in the middle of his voice, occasionally a little bit higher, but he can scoop up and down his scales and his range very efficiently and very well, and he's one of the few idols to do it to such a fantastic ability. So, I can sit here and talk about agility all day, but instead of me doing that, why don't we just watch a compilation of Kyungsoo and his fantastic soulful vocal runs. Okay, as well as that, changes over time. A lot of idols change vocally hugely. It can be in terms of delivery or technique or the way they do things, the keys that they are written. Kyungsoo debuted already pretty damn good. The only thing he really changed noticeably over time is A, his confidence, and B, where EXO were allowed to sing and his voice was particularly put in by SM. So, the main noticeable difference is on their debut stage of Mama. Dio had a slightly difficult time with the high note because it was sung outside of his supported normal range. As I've mentioned, the Mama, it's really not an easy note to do if you are naturally a bit of a chesty mix user like Dio is. And when he started and when he debuted, because he was being asked to sing in these really high, like I think it's C#5 mixed belt, it affected his confidence a little bit and he struggled to really maintain notes in that key, and obviously the rest of his voice kind of suffered a little bit because of that. He was always good, he was never bad. He just has noticeably gained hugely in confidence as the years have gone on because he's been asked to sing in a less demanding range for him, and Baekhyun and Chen have been given these higher parts, which has allowed Kyungsoo to really develop his chesty mix and really work out what works in his voice, where his technique really shines, and how he can really get the best out of his vocal delivery, his tone, and his timbre. That is the main thing that Kyungsoo has really developed on later in his career. Nothing to do with technique really, he's always had an open forward placement. He's just being asked to sing in a less demanding range, and that has noticeably changed his progression and improvement all the way through his melodic singing range. Beyond that, he doesn't really do anything a great deal differently. Things are just a bit better, a bit more polished than they always were. He hasn't really developed much more of a head voice than he did earlier in his career. He hasn't really improved his lows much since then. He's always just had the baseline of his voice that works in this area really well, but instead of being asked to sing here, he's been asked to sing here, and that whole section has really benefited from that more focused training and attention. Okay guys, that's pretty much everything about Kyungsoo's voice wrapped up, but in this last little section I'm going to do my classic summary because I like to repeat myself a million times. I'm doing this predominantly for two reasons. A, the guys that have been watching the whole video and have kind of lost track of some things that I've said, I'm going to go through his strengths in one little tiny little bit here, and his weaknesses also kind of all mashed up into one. And this is also for the guys that want to know a little about Kyungsoo, what his voice does really well, what doesn't do so well, but haven't got time to watch a whole 40-minute video explaining everything about him. Okay, so basically, his main vocal strengths are as follows. In his lower range, he has a fantastic neutral larynx all the way down to around a D3, mixing his heaviness of his vocal delivery average when he sings normally and when he speaks, along with a lightness which allows him to have flexibility in the lower part of his voice, down around a D3 or so with nice connection, nice agility, and able to sing in that way very comfortably and very relaxed. His belt range is absolutely fantastic and supported up to around a B-flat 4, and all the way through he uses a very powerful forward chest dominant mix, which allows him to have power, projection, agility, and he again can mix the heaviness of his vocal tone with the lightness, which allows him to get all the way through that part of his range very efficiently and very nicely. He also can sing with a nice disconnected falsetto up to around a C#5 or so, similar to most idol tenors, and can have a very relaxed, easy, transitional falsetto and chest voice mix, and can get in that area of his voice nice and efficiently, nice and easily, and can do so with no strain and no overcompression. He's also one of the most vocally agile idols in K-pop. That is not up for debate. He can use vocal runs very efficiently, great melisma, and he has fantastic projection, fantastic accuracy, and fantastic musicality when he does his more R&B driven style. Okay, so those are his main vocal strengths, kind of really summarised down. His main vocal weaknesses are that below a D3, his voice doesn't really have any sort of projection or power and often becomes very airy, or vocal fry becomes really prominent very quickly, so he doesn't really use his voice below the D3 normally because he doesn't really know how to drop his larynx very well or to kind of add more chest to the sound to make it more projected, more powerful in this particular area. As well as that, sometimes in his mix he can look up, or he can have issues with his confidence, which makes him strain a little bit more. Can lead to voice cracks, or it can just cause more of a shouty, yelly quality rather than the resonant forward phonation that he normally indicates that he can do. As well as that, he doesn't really have much of an explored fifth octave. He, on occasion, has showcased that he can use a really high mixed belt. He can also use a more disconnected falsetto, but he hasn't really showcased much in the way of projection or ability kind of in a head voice above an F5 on occasion, very underexplored, and hasn't really been utilised enough to really have a fantastically varied and able head voice. Okay, so those were my summarised thoughts on Kyung-soo, the strengths, his weaknesses, everything about him. I hope this video was good, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to make. I've been wanting to do one of these for a very, very, very long time. I hope the structure was okay. Hope you found it interesting. I hope you learnt something. And I hope for you guys who just like Kyung-soo, you enjoyed listening to me speak about for 40 minutes. Because I love Kyung-soo as well. Okay, I don't know who will be next in this series. I'll work it out later. I'm not sure what video I'm going to do next. It'll be a vocal ranking most likely. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching. I enjoy making this so much. I really hope you guys enjoy watching it as well. For now, goodbye.